I feel like the only reason I get work, the only reason I've been able to sort of make a go at as a comics creator is for the opposite reason. The only reason people come to me is because they want what's unique about me. They want, the for better or for worse, they want the Mark Russell experience.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Philippine International Comics Festival. And I am Duy from the Comics Cube. I am with the award-winning Mark Russell. How are you?
Doing good. Thanks, Duy.
I believe that you are, as recently as this year's Eisners, an award winner for Not All Robots.
Yeah, that's true. It won the Eisner Award for Best Humor Publication. So I'm very, very gratified that we finally won one.
I don't know if you've seen the sentiments behind it, but I saw a lot of people get confused that it won for Best Humor Publication, because to them they couldn't see why it was a humor publication.
It's a very darkly humorous book. Yeah, no, I actually take that as a compliment when people are like, I did not think this was a humor comic, because it means they're getting the gravity of the story. But I consider it a humor comic, but it's a very dark one.
Plus, that Mike Deodato artwork is a Trojan horse, Mark.
Yeah, originally I thought that, I was a little surprised when they suggested Mike as the artist for that, because I knew him mostly from his Marvel superhero stuff, and I thought, well, is he really a good match for what is basically a sci-fi satire? But then they showed me some of the original concept art he did, and I was just totally sold immediately. In fact, I think his artwork's perfect for it, because he plays it straight. He plays it like this is the most natural thing in the world, which allows the lines and the jokes and the absurdity of the situation to kind of like to run with the ball.
I'm sorry, we went straight to the Eisner Award for Not All Robots, but would you mind telling our viewers what Not All Robots is about and why
First things first. So Not All Robots tells a story of the near future when robots have all the jobs, and it specifically takes place in Atlanta, which at this point in the future is housed entirely inside like an air conditioned, climate controlled bubble. And it's really a parable for toxic masculinity, because it's about how the robots resent having to like take care of these human families they've been assigned to, and how the humans live in terror of the robot that now lives inside their house.
So that sounds to me like you took a current contemporary experience, and then you added an element so you could shift the roles down a little bit, right?
Right. Yeah. And I think that's what satire generally does. It takes real problems that are real issues today and puts them in a context where people can talk about them without feeling immediately defensive. So in this case, it's about, sort of response to the Me Too movement, and more specifically the backlash to the Me Too movement, the Not All Men movement, which was sort of hence the title Not All Robots, about men being defensive. And it really, I think, is about how a lot of the problems is that we've been sort of weaponized against each other, that we've been turned against each other by the difference in our economic roles, and how we've been trained to see our worth in terms of like how much money we produce.
Mark, in a day and age where grown men are fighting over whether or not a mermaid should be played by a black person,
right?
How absurd
people are very worried about the scientific accuracy of freaking mermaids.
People can't get tans under the sea, Mark.
What an age we live in.
How important is it to shine an absurd light on the things we fight about?
I think it's very important. I think not only because it allows us to talk about these things in a way that, again, isn't accusatory or immediately putting people on the defensive. It's a way of like getting people who maybe need to hear these things, a way to read them. And maybe at the end of the book, the light bulb goes off. Like, wait a minute, I'm like the robots. I think that in the end, this is what changes us. We're not really changed by arguments or, battles. We're changed by stories. And the more we begin to sort of see stories and see, realize who we identify with in the story, and who we want to identify, who we aspire to identify with in stories, that's when we begin to change ourselves.
Do you think that's why arguments don't really work online or at all? Is because somebody will cling to his own story regardless of the stories of the other people?
Yeah, arguments, though, I think it's important to have debates and arguments. They're more for spectators, for people watching, than they are for the combatants, people actually in the argument, because they place people in an immediately adversarial role. And so it tends to entrench people in their positions rather than bring them to some sort of empathetic position where they could see the other side. Whereas stories operate kind of the opposite way. They're non-adversarial, they're non-combative, and everyone starts reading a story with the idea of engaging it, of placing themselves in the middle of the story. So I think it is really a better engine for telling people how they might want to change than debates or arguments.
So let's backtrack a little bit. Before you got into comics, you wrote a couple of books drawn by Shannon Wheeler. You're no stranger to controversy. Would you like to tell us?
I've kind of built my career around
controversy,
things people hate.
But yeah. How did those couple of books go, and how were they received?
Well, they were actually received very well. They sold well. At least the first one did. And
God is disappointed in you.
Yeah, and people like them, but they're both about the Bible. I wrote 2 books about the Bible. The first one, God is Disappointed in You, is a retelling of the Bible in modern language with very, very short versions of the books of the Bible. And the second one, Apocrypha Now, is about the books that didn't make it into the canonical Bible. Books from the Jewish Midrash or the Christian Apocrypha. And really, the controversy that these books caused, I think, was mostly from people who hadn't read them, which seems to be the story of my career. It's like anytime I get in trouble, it's always the people who haven't actually read what I've done. I got in a similar trouble with Second Coming, which is my comic book about Jesus Christ returning to Earth and sharing an apartment with a superhero. But all the controversy, all the petitions to get DC to drop it, which eventually they kind of did. They kind of politely asked me to take it somewhere else, which was fine with me. I don't know why they were publishing my comic about Jesus Christ in the first place, but they it was all the people signing the petition. None of them had read a single page of the book. None of them knew what was in it. They just knew that it was about Jesus Christ. And I think especially among the conservative Christian community, they saw this almost as like intellectual property theft. Like Jesus was their character that they owned, and nobody else had a right to an opinion or to tell that story. So I think they were very offended just at the idea that somebody else would, outside their community, would be writing about Jesus Christ. And that's why there was all this uproar before it even came out. And then once it came out, the controversy just sort of died because people saw that it wasn't actually an assassination attempt on Jesus Christ. It was actually very respectful, and he's actually the good guy of the story. It's really more about human violence in the way that our institutions have warped Christianity and human compassion and weaponized us against each other.
This seems to be a running theme in your work, the weaponization of humans against each other.
Yeah, it really, most of my work, if there's a theme that unifies it all, it's about how the institutions that were created to serve us ultimately start expecting us to serve them. And that's where civilization turns for the worse.
When did you realize that this would be the kind of thing that you would need to, you would need to let out onto a page, you would need to let out onto a printed page, whether it's in comics or in prose?
I don't think I ever thought very consciously about it. I just sort of wrote about the thing that was bothering the most, or the idea I had that I couldn't get out of my brain, that kept coming back to me. I think that as a writer, that's ultimately what you do, is you find out what you have the most to talk about, what it is that gives you the most to say, and that's what you write. it just happened to me. Like in retrospect, I look back and said, "Wow, this really is just what I've been writing about lately." Is like what I see as the foundational problems with human civilization, and I think it's because, especially now, I see us coming to an end point where civilization, as we've been practicing it for the last couple thousand years, doesn't really seem tenable anymore. We're going to have to make some pretty radical changes to the way we live on this planet if we wish to survive the century. So I think that's why it's sort of occupied my subconscious over the last 10 years in the way nothing else really has.
You're talking about climate change or the impending civil war of humanity?
Well, I think they're not mutually exclusive. I think that climate change will push us to wars, to resource scarcity, to mass refugee mass mass exoduses all over the planet, and we will either come to terms with this and begin facilitating the free movement of human beings and ideas, and or we will, in the dissolution of national borders and the idea of nationalism, or we will die. We'll die fighting over the scraps.
Based on the past 2 to 6 years, which option do you think humanity is going to pick?
Probably fighting over the scraps. If I had to bet. Of course, it doesn't do me any good to bet on that proposition because I won't be around to collect the winnings if it pays off. So I'm hopefully putting my chips on that we will wake up in time to change the way we organized ourselves politically on this planet to facilitate the free movement of people and material goods to help each other survive what will be the greatest challenge since the advent of agriculture.
When did you start writing, Mark?
I've always been a writer as far back as I can remember. I think the moment I realized I was a writer when I was like 12 years old, and I had a notebook, which seemed like to me just an awesome tome of, it seemed like this massive book of stories. It was probably only about 40 pages in a notebook of like little stories and things I'd written down. And my mom found it and she hated it. So, there were dirty words in there. There was sort of, like violence and stuff. So she threw out the notebook. All my life's work in it, she threw it out. And rather than get upset or, anything, the next day I just started a new notebook. And I think that's when it occurred to me, no, this is what I am on a fundamental level. I'm a writer. I never imagined that I would actually make a living that way or that anybody would read it. But I thought, this is, if for no one else, this is how I tell the universe how it's killing me.
So I think a funny story about your career is that despite the fact that you worked on 2 books with legendary comics artist Shannon Wheeler of Too Much Coffee Man, Marie Javins of DC Comics discovered you not through that, but through Count Chocula fan fiction. Yeah,
it's the worst origin story in the history of comics, I think. And when people ask me, well, how did you break into comics, thinking that they're going to follow my method to breaking it, it's like they always seem kind of disappointed because it's utterly inimitable. But yeah, I had written books, and one which was very well received and sold a lot of copies. So I just always assumed, well, DC came calling because I had this hit book, but it wasn't that at all. Shannon Wheeler, who you mentioned, the cartoonist who did all the cartoons for the Guys Point, was friends with Marie Javins, who at the time was a new editor at DC Comics. And so we had friended each other on Facebook. I didn't really know her very well, but I just started posting these sort of vignettes of like not only Count Chocula, but also Frankenberry and Blueberry, as if they were in some sort of Game of Thrones kill or be killed universe. And they spoke in these very Baroque sort of medieval ways. And she apparently had been reading this on Facebook, and I had no idea. And that's why DC contacted me. Not because of the years of research I've spent pouring into these massive books, but because of the Count Chocula fan fiction I've been posting on Facebook. So I guess if you are looking for an object lesson how to break into comics, in this case, it would be just put your writing out any way you can, because you never know who's going to be looking. even if it's just on Facebook, even if it's just, your fan fiction put in a stapled zine or on a blog, put it out, because anytime it's out in public, it not only subconsciously, I think, makes you write better, because you think, well, somebody's going to read this, therefore I've got to edit it. It's got to be clear. And, I've got to, basically get this comic dressed and ready to go outside. But also because you just never know who's going to be reading it. And, everything you put out in the world is a lottery ticket that may or may not get scratched off.
So luck does have something to do with it.
Luck has a lot to do with it, but you like the lottery, the more tickets you buy, the more likely you are to have a winner.
But also, yeah, good.
So the more you put out there, the better your luck will be.
So I think another object lesson there is that clearly she gravitated towards your voice, which is today one of the most unique voices in comics. Do you think that has something to do with the fact that you were not a comics fan growing up?
Yeah, my voice has a lot to do with the fact that I didn't read a lot of comics. And I think that most writers who write comics have loved comics and have been, aspired to write comics sort of their whole lives. So they tend to sound like other comics writers. And I'm not saying I'm like some horribly unique, the bird of paradise in the comics world and everybody else is a copycat. But my influences were very different, I think, than most comic book writers, and I think it shows. And so I think, again, the advice I would give to aspiring comic book writers would be to be influenced by something outside of comics, whether it's science or like manga or video games or whatever. Be inspired by something outside of the medium you want to write in, and bring whatever it is that you love outside that world into that world. And that's what kind of makes it unique.
What is that for you outside of real world issues and politics? And
I think for me, the biggest thing is probably history. I'm a history nut. I'm especially fascinated with ancient history. So a lot of the things I write tend to have sort of parallels or, be based on ancient history. In fact, I did the longest I've ever written on a single series to date was Red Sonja, which I wrote 26 issues of Red Sonja. And the reason I took that gig was because they allowed me to base her story off of the story of Queen Tomyris, which is told in the histories of Herodotus. And it's about the steppes queen who leads this scrappy little tribe called the Massagatai into war against the mightiest empire on earth, which at the time was the Persians. And about how she runs Cyrus the Great ragged, like doing the scorched earth campaign, like leading him on a wild goose chase and ambushing his men when she can until he's like weak enough. Then she turns around and attacks. And I thought it was such a great story from ancient history that it would be, Red Sonja would be like the perfect sort of comics related title to tell that story, to tell a loose interpretation of that story.
Right. So it wasn't about you telling a Red Sonja story because you were such a fan of Red Sonja. It was a vehicle for you to tell that particular historical story,
which, as far as I know, nobody had done. So I think, again, I think it really what makes your writing unique as a comics writer is about what you bring in from outside of comics.
Yeah.
And for me, that was, in that case, it was the story from ancient history.
It reminds me of Frank Miller, actually, because Frank Miller has said that the reason that he took Daredevil was because he was such a crime nut and he saw him as a vehicle for which to do crime comics.
Yeah.
Just with a dude in a costume.
And I think you see that also with Sin City. It's like a noir novel set in comics, which at the time was, there's been 100 imitators since then. But that time was really fresh, new. But it had to do with his obsessions outside of comics.
I think the genius of Sin City is that it's both noirish and absurd enough that when he introduces samurais, you're like, okay, cool, they're samurais now.
Why not? Yeah, why not? I think that's it. It's really about the marriage of the two. The influence that you bring in from outside comics, and then bending it so it's not just about the thing you're writing about outside it, but it's warped and changed to make it a comic book. And it's sort of like the combination of these two flavors, the chocolate and the peanut butter, that gives you something unique.
What exactly is it about comics that, you know, prose can't give you, other than visuals, of course? But I mean, like in terms of reader, reader experience or creator experience.
Well, I think there's two things about comics that make it like a really unique and rewarding creator experience. First, and reader experience. And I think the first is that it works roughly like the human brain works, because the human brain, at the same time it processes visual information, we could stop and think and process it internally. So the human brain is this sort of combination of the exterior and the interior. And whereas when you're reading a novel, it's all interior. It's all just happening in your brain, and there's no processing of visual data. And when you're watching a movie, it's all exterior. You're taking in all these images, but they're happening, in real time at the speed of the director. So there's no time for the interiority of it. So comics is really the only one that gives you both, where you are bringing in the visual data from outside, but you could stop and give yourself time to process it internally. And that's how the human brain works. So I think it's a uniquely human art form in that sense, and it works well with their minds, which is I think why they're starting to use comics more as a teaching tool, why it's so much easier to teach kids and adults concepts using comics than it is with instruction manuals or textbooks. The other thing I think makes comics uniquely rewarding for creators is that it's a visual medium in which there's a relatively low upfront investment of money. Like if you want to write in TV, or you want to write movies where millions of dollars are on the line in a budget, you're going to have a lot of executives looking over your shoulder, or you're going to have focus groups that are going to tell you how to change your story. But because the stakes are relatively lower in comics, there aren't these millions of dollars being invested in a single issue or series of comics, you have more freedom to tell stories that don't exist in other mediums. You have more freedom to tell stories that are maybe a little outside the box. And so for me, I don't understand why anybody is writing comics and isn't telling, isn't pushing the envelope, isn't telling stories that push the credibility of the genre. Because it's like there's plenty of incentive to be conservative and accessible when you're in other mediums and TV and film. Comics is the one visual medium that allows you to just go nuts. So I don't understand why more writers and artists don't use that freedom.
Do you think it's because maybe some are hoping to get picked up by TV? And
yeah, I think some people, not a lot, and I wouldn't name names, but because I don't know the names, I don't know who these people are, but I think maybe some people see comics as sort of slumming. Like, I'm temporarily working in this dumpster medium until I can break into like movies or TV. I imagine some people are thinking that. Jokes on them if they are. But I think also maybe some people are just afraid. They're afraid that if they tell the story they want to tell, that it won't sell, or that editors will hate it and they'll never get hired to write anything again, which is a valid fear. But in my experience, I feel like the only reason I get work, the only reason I've been able to sort of make a go at as a comics creator, is for the opposite reason. The only reason people come to me is because they want what's unique about me. They want for better or for worse, they want the Mark Russell experience. So for me, the conservatism of trying to be lowest common denominator is a recipe for failure, not for success.
The Mark Russell experience. You are one of the most prolific writers working today.
It sounds so pretentious when I say it out loud, and but I don't claim it's like an incredible experience. It's just different.
Well, I haven't run the numbers, but I think maybe Tom Taylor writes more titles than you, and that's about it.
Yeah, I think Tom's probably the most prolific.
Also, you're probably not close to his current number.
Well,
He's
number
kind
of
of
sales?
Insane. No, the number of books that he writes per month.
Yeah, either way, I'm probably nowhere close.
But yeah, I think it's him and then you. But
I think somebody's mentioned this before, like the Jeff Lemire threshold, where it's like there's like Jeff Lemire productivity is sort of like the red line where the boiler's getting too hot. You got to cool it down, because he's a really prolific writer too. He writes usually works on tons of titles at the same time. But yeah, I think I'm just a little bit below the Jeff Lemire threshold, so I can continue chugging along.
But you were talking about Red Sonja, and of course, you wrote a lot of books for DC, the Flintstones and Snuffleupagus. Wait, no, not Snuffleupagus. Snagglepuss. That's Big Bird's friend. So Snagglepuss.
Someday.
And of course, you brought the Mark Russell experience to those things. And again, it seems like a thing where you had your message to say, and then you used these characters that everybody knows to say those messages.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something you were tasked to do by Marie, or did you pitch that?
They approached me, and I think they originally approached me because they thought they wanted to do something with the Flintstones that was different than the original cartoon. One thing I've learned is that everybody really hates a tasteful homage. So there's really no reason in trying to, when you're working with an old property, there's no point trying to just sort of recreate the old property, because people had that. And people might pick up a copy of the Flintstones or this old property thing because they like the old thing. But if it's just the old thing, they're going to lose interest really quickly. So you have to do something new with it. And to me, it's like when I'm writing a title, I try to figure out, especially a title that's characters I don't create and that I'm not particularly close to. The Flintstones were one such title. I then, in order to get myself engaged in it, I have to ask myself, well, what is it about them that I do like? I wasn't a huge Flintstones fan going into writing, but I thought, well, what is it that I do like about the Flintstones that does resonate with me? And for me, the answer was two things. It was the story of Bedrock as the world's first civilization, which I thought was pretty cool, and also the animal appliances, and how Fred would come home after a hard day at the quarry and complain about how badly Mr. Slate was treating him. But meanwhile, he's got like a pig that lives underneath the sink, or in my case, like a bowling ball that lives in the closet, perpetual darkness. So it's about how being reduced to these economic roles sort of blinds us to each other's pain. So we imagine we're the only victim. We've kind of been set against each other. So to me, that was what the story was going to be about. It was going to be about the fundamental flaws of civilization and about how we are alienated from each other by the fact that we've been reduced to economic roles like bowling ball or vacuum cleaner or man who works in quarry.
So when Maria approached you, did you still have to write a proposal?
Yeah. She approached me about doing the Flintstones and said, well, just put together this pitch. And so I put together a pitch that sort of roughly outlines what I just said. And I had little breakdowns for each of the characters and what they'd be like. And they seemed really happy with it. Hanna-Barbera initially seemed much less happy with it. They, as soon as the first issue came out, or at least I don't remember if it was after the first issue came out or after the first script was turned in, but I got like a sheet of notes from Hanna-Barbera saying, no references to any deities. Fred Flintstone has to say yabba dabba do once an issue, and on and on and on. And I kind of talked to Maria and said, this isn't really what I signed up for, and I don't think I can work with all these stipulations. So she and Dan DiDio got together and they said, don't worry about it. Just write the story you're going to write, and we'll handle the outside people, which was really liberating for me. And they did. They kept those people off my back. They took some heat because initially people were not very happy with what I was doing with the Flintstones, and some people tried to get me fired off of it. There were people inside DC who were extremely against it, and a lot of the reviews, the first couple issues, were very negative. One, I think, reviewer likened it to Garfield's Summer Adventure. But I think different strokes for different folks. It's okay to not like my comics. But I think what it was it wasn't what people were expecting. It's sort of like when you're expecting to eat a piece of chocolate and it turns out to be beef jerky. It could be the most delicious beef jerky in the world, but you spit it out because it wasn't what you were expecting. And I think that's was kind of what happened initially with the Flintstones. But I think after like 3 or 4 issues came out, people got what I was doing with it. Then the critical reception began to do a U-turn, and people started embracing it.
And now it's revered.
Like, yeah, it's weird. At the time, I thought, well, this is certainly the last comic book they're ever going to let me write, because my first comic book prez had been such a bomb sales-wise, and then this one like appeared destined for similar oblivion because people were hating on it. But at some point, I think it was because because I thought this is the last comic I was ever going to write. I might as well just go for broke. I might as well, everything I'm going to say in comics, I'm going to say now, and I'm not going to hold any bars. And I think that's ultimately what made it work. And that's kind of been my formula ever since. It's like, just go out and say what it is you really care about within the context of a story, and let the chips fall where they may.
Safe to say that with every comic you write, you feel like it's going to be the last comic that you're going to write?
No, not anymore. I'm jaded by success. I always feel like there will be another one. But one thing I do sort of feel like is that now I can sort of pace myself. I don't have to sort of cram it all in. So I can do a comic about, about billionaires. I can do a comic about religion. I can do a comic about, global warming. I don't have to, or a comic about, toxic masculinity. I don't have to cram all the commentary into one single comic. I could spread it out more.
When you wrote the proposal for the Flintstones and you were writing for the Flintstones, did you end up binging the Flintstones for reference, or?
No, I tried to watch the Flintstones on YouTube, and to be honest, I found it kind of unwatchable. The best part of every episode of the Flintstones is the opening credits. And so I really like watching the opening credit scene, but then after that, it just sort of sinks in finality. So I didn't binge a lot. What I did was I did more sort of like online research about obscure characters in the Flintstones to see if there were any I wanted to bring back and use. Like, for example, I brought back Wilma's mother, who appeared I think in only like 1 or 2 episodes, and her last name was Snagglepuss. So I brought back like Edna Snagglepuss, Wilma's mother, from the Flintstones, things like that.
Yeah, I only know her from the movie. She was played by Elizabeth Taylor.
Really, I've never seen
the movie. And then for Snagglepuss, so you were approached for that as well, right?
Yeah, well, that one was, again, sort of good luck on Facebook story. I had been posting on Facebook these sort of conversations between Snagglepuss and Huckleberry Hound as if they were, gay Southern Gothic playwrights, as if these were conversations between Tennessee Williams and William Faulkner. And just because I thought it was funny, and I didn't intend for this to be a whole thing. I just wrote a few of these sort of, conversations. And then Marie contacted me and said, by the way, your Snagglepuss comic has been approved. So then I thought, wow, I guess I gotta write a Snagglepuss comic. But again, for me, the thing, I just had to sort of think about what it is I wanted to build a Snagglepuss story around. And for me, the 2 things I knew about Snagglepuss were that he's a gay icon, and also that he obviously has a background in theater, because both of his catchphrases, Heaven to Murgatroyd and Exit Stage Left, are both theater things. So I thought, well, this is what I'm going to build my story around. Oh, and the third thing is the date on which his first TV show aired. So I'm going to write this as a prequel to him being on TV, like in the 1950s. He's a gay playwright, and what would have happened in the 1950s that would cause him to have to leave theater and go into this, what was then seen as this cursed sort of netherworld of television. And that's when I came up with the House Un-American Activities Committee hearings. And but I really built the story around those 2 tentpoles. He's a gay icon, and he's a theater person.
This is this is something I told you, I think the first time we ever spoke, which is that so we were talking about Not All Robots earlier and how people are confused by why it's a humor publication. But I think it's actually Snagglepuss that isn't that funny. You tell it's so straight, it's so serious. It just so happens there are talking animals in it.
Yeah, and I don't think it's primarily a comedy. I think there's witty lines, repartee. There's moments that are funny, but I see it as first and foremost a tragedy. But a tragedy that with some redemption in it. To me, I think it might be the most human and empathetic story I've ever written.
If you had told that story in without the talking animals, if you had told the same story with humans, I think that the non-humor would be more transparent.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the fact that it uses cartoon animals sort of leavens a little bit, makes it a little more accessible to people who otherwise might just view it purely as a tragedy. I think also it really lent itself to the parable of like, these are people who exist outside society while in the midst of society. It's like there's a scene where Snagglepuss as a young kid grows up in rural Mississippi, like Tennessee Williams did. And there's a scene where there's all these sort of dour men in their overalls just sort of walking around. And there's this one sort of bright pink like cat like walking around in the midst of these men. And to me, that was like sort of a perfect way to sort of capture the feeling of being somewhere where you don't belong.
Can you compare writing a proposal for DC for licensed characters versus writing a proposal, for something like Ahoy, with your own properties, your own creations?
Yeah, I think that because there's like already so much cultural equity in something like a Batman script, or Superman, or even like Flintstones, you don't have to invent the wheel as much. You don't have to describe who the characters are and why people should care about them. People automatically understand why they care about Batman or don't care about Batman or the Flintstones. So you when you're pitching a story with recognized intellectual property, you tend to focus more on the story and what's different about it, what's unique about this story as opposed to all the other stories about these characters. Whereas when you're creating a story from scratch with characters you've created, you have to do much more focus on the characters themselves, explain who these characters are, why the reader will care about them. And so I think that the creator-owned series tend to be a lot more sort of character driven, because you are having to create characters that the reader doesn't know but needs to care about.
So with something like Second Coming does have cultural equity because you're using Jesus and
a superhero who's like sort of like, there's a certain amount of like expectation. Well, this is what a superhero is, does. But yeah, that one was obviously kind of like a middle. It was a little of both. It was both creator owned and sort of like also capitalized on the cultural equity of people knowing roughly who these characters are. But a lot of what that comic is about how these characters defy expectations, about how these characters are not what most people think they are, what they should be in the world. And that's kind of the point. It's about how they've been sort of the lost to the institutions that were created up around them.
Yeah, so something like Second Coming and Jesus, right? Like you do make it so that it's not what people think he is, but it's actually better.
More like what and part of it, that was, what I discovered when I was writing God is Disappointing, my book about the Bible, is that the Bible itself was actually much different than what I had been taught it was when I was in church and, in Sunday school growing up. And so I wanted to write about that in Second Coming too, about how the Christ of the Bible is very different than the Christ of evangelical Christianity.
How much of that, Mark, is you growing up in that kind of environment, but also you being a very curious child? Like you just read a lot, and how
I think a lot of it was the catharsis of like real life, because I rejected my religion during my teen years, and I had always sort of written off the Bible as just kind of being nonsense and Christianity as pernicious. But then when I was working on God is Disappointed You, I realized that the problem wasn't really with Christ or Christianity, but it was with Christians. And that a lot of what he said and did was wonderful and really quite radical, because I think the ancient world, like the modern one, is built kind of on two things, like bribery and punishment. It's like you get people to do what you want them to do by bribing them with money or by punishing them if they fail to do it. And that's kind of what is the world has run on since we started living together in groups of people. And in a lot of ways, Christ was like one of the world's most radical philosophers, in that he tried to come up with a third way, which was like, no, it's just about, compassion and taking care of people solely because they need it. Meeting people where they live and not caring about whether you get anything in return. And I think part of that stems from the fact that, he grew up under Roman occupation in Judea, and the Romans were excellent at putting down revolts. It's like anytime there was an armed revolt against the Romans, they put it down because that's what they had basically trained themselves to do. It might take them a little while, but eventually they would put down your revolt. And so I think what Christ asked himself was like, not how do we rid ourselves of the Romans, but how do we rid ourselves of the very idea of empire? And the answers he came up with were basically dropping out. It's like if they want to bribe you to get you to participate in their world, don't care about money. They want to punish you because you won't do what they say. It's like don't care about being punished. Be willing to suffer. And I think he showed the Roman Empire the one thing they couldn't possibly defend against, which is why they had to crucify him.
When you are pitching for these particular projects, do you already have an artist that you're working with, or do they get assigned to you afterwards?
If I'm pitching for like a big two company, or really any publisher, I never have an artist in mind. We get it approved first, and then we go look for an artist. With creator-owned stuff, a lot of times I'll have an artist in mind, and I'll have spoken to that artist about what would you like to do this if it gets approved and they're on board. And I sometimes put that in the pitch, like this will ideally be done by this artist who I've already spoken to. So it's a very different thing. But when you're working with like a DC or Marvel series, they like to have a lot more say in who does the art than when you're working on a creator-owned series.
And how do you work with these artists if you don't get the artist that you were thinking of? Like when you start writing the script, how does that process go?
Well, I think that it really helps whoever your artist is, whether it was someone you're planning to work with or not, to have a conversation with them before, if they ever lay a pencil on paper, just to talk about the series, to talk about what your visual influences are, what you're thinking, what's going through your head as you're laying the pages down. And also to figure out what kind of artist they are. Like, are you an artist who wants a lot of information? Like you want me to like diagram out to you where everything is supposed to be in the panel? Or do you find that oppressive? Are you someone who just wants the bare minimum amount of information and you want to use your own imagination to fill out the rest? Figure out what kind of artist you're dealing with. And then when you actually start working, the communication, I think, flows a lot more easily, and you aren't, stepping on each other's toes.
How does that inform the story that you end up writing? Because so I'm just picking two names off the top of my head. Richard Pace can draw a lot of detail. He's very detailed. Mm-hmm. He can fit a lot of stuff in, a lot of texture. Mike Allred, who you're working with on Superman Space Age, is not about that. He's about minimalistic lines. So how does that affect your scripting process and the story that you're trying to tell overall?
Yeah, one thing, it does affect it a lot, because when you get the artwork back and you realize that the dialogue or all the captions and stuff you put on it sort of don't necessarily at some point they begin to hinder the story, that you are getting in the way of telling your own story. And I went through this a lot on Superman Space Age with Mike, where it's like when I got his artwork back, I realized, just because you say it's all simplistic, and not simplistic, but they're very straight lines, with very bold. I guess that's the word I'm looking for. It's very bold and striking. So my main challenge was to get out of his way as much as possible. To, if a line can be cut, cut it. If a balloon can be cut, all the better. Get rid of it. Let the lines and the visuals tell as much of the story as possible. And I think Richard conversely has a much more sort of intimate art style where you feel like this is somebody almost like a Rembrandt. This is like you know, an old man hunched over a table eating a fish. And so it's okay to like have these bigger boxes talking about that old man's thoughts, because he leaves you with these images that are very, I think, much sort of clue you into what this person is thinking internally. So yeah, I think you do adjust your writing to hopefully complement the style of the art you're dealing with.
Is Superman Space Age the biggest project that you've had so far?
I think so. I think it's probably the biggest profile project I've had so far in comics, and that people had pretty high expectations at the beginning, and also I think it's something that people might be reading a long time from now, hopefully. So yeah, I think it's in a lot of ways sort of it's, if not the milestone, it's certainly a milestone in my career.
And once again, you're bringing your love of history into it because you're starting this from the 1960s.
Yeah, it's largely based upon the again, taking two things that don't necessarily belong together and creating a third thing. Those two things are the Cold War history of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and the world of Superman.
What does working with somebody like Mike Allred bring to the table, aside from you having to remove some dialogue balloons?
I mean, him and Laura both are just brilliant artists, very creative, and so I think this is what I like to do when I'm working with an artist. I like to allow as much room as possible for their creativity, because then it becomes a true collaboration. And so yeah, it really is a chance to sort of like just be a member of a band and just sort of jam with people who you trust implicitly. And that to me is like the highest experience you can have in comics as a creator.
I'm sure the answer to this question will change in degrees depending on who you're working with, but do you write full script?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I always write full script. I don't know how to write any other way. And I feel like it's just strategically better for me to write that way, because I can always pare it down later when I'm getting the art, or when the artist says it's too much. It's very difficult to go the opposite way though. It's very difficult to start with almost no script, to hand it off to somebody, and then to say, oh, and there's all this other stuff I want to put in there after the fact. So it's easier, I think, to start with a lot and dial it back than to start with nothing and put it in as they go.
But do you write with more or less detail or instructions depending on an artist?
For Mike, yeah, exactly. And I think part of it's that conversation I was talking about. And so like with Mike and Laura, I try to put in only the relevant information, like what needs to be in the panel, and leave as much to their imagination as possible. But there are other artists who they like a lot more information, and I think that when I am giving an artist a ton of information, describing the way somebody's head is bowed, or where they're the way where their arms are in the scene and stuff, it's not that I'm trying to like be a control freak. It's with the caveat that like, well, this is the movie that's playing in my head. If you see something different, I will defer to your vision because you are the artist. But this is just what's going through my head. And a lot of artists like that. They want to know how you're seeing it, knowing that they have the freedom to go with how they see it.
And if they're having a bad day, they can just do it exactly the way you see it.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of times, and I think that's why a lot of artists like that information, because they are saving that sort of creative explosion for splash pages, or for really monumental and pivotal scenes, and they don't want to have to think that through every single panel like that. So if there's like 4 or 5 panels a page, and 4 or 5 pages at a time, where that sort of directorial work is done for them, then it allows them to really focus on, like, the splash page or the page turn, where they really do need to bring their A game creatively.
We were talking earlier about being a member of a band, and also now with the artist being able to take what you say and then change it depending on how they see it. What do you make of journalists or even fans who, when they talk about a particular comic, they only credit the writer?
Yeah, it's no good. When it happens to me, I always find it kind of embarrassing, because it's like, I was like half, if that, of this process. And so I really like, I think it's okay when you're reviewing an article to talk specifically about the writing versus the art stuff. But when you're heaping praise or scorn on a comic, you have to credit the whole team. The comic is so much more than the writer. And really, frankly, is more than the artist too. The coloring's incredibly important. The editor's important. The lettering's important. It really needs to be seen more as a cohesive whole than just, something that springs from the head of a writer.
Yeah, I think maybe a lot of it is journalists or fans thinking that the idea is the main thing. Which,
and it's fair when
you're
critiquing, like, the plot, or an idea, the concept, to go after the writer, because they're the ones coming up with these things. But if you're talking generally about the comic and whether or not you loved it or hated it, or the overall quality of the comic, that are talking about the whole team.
Yeah, because I'm thinking of, like, so the idea, the plot, sure, the writer, the draftsmanship, the artist.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking like the pacing, like, we have no way of knowing who did that.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, there's things that are definitely the writer, like the basic idea and the story. And there are things that are definitely the artist, the way it looks and feels visually. And then there are things that sort of lurk in between, like you say, the pacing and, the quality of, like, page turns and stuff. And I think when it's not clear who you're talking about, whether you're talking about the work or the writer or the artist, then it's fair to just talk about the whole team, because, the writer had a hand in it, the artist had a hand in it, and the editor, frankly, probably had a hand in making it what it is you're enjoying. And certainly the colorist did too.
How important is an editor to the making of a comic, whether it is for a licensed property or your own property?
Editors are critically important. And I think that, there are different kinds of editors, just like there are different kinds of artists. And some are, see their role is to be more like a traditional publishing editor, where they're actually, like, going over the story with you and things that don't work or things that work, and, like, trying to, like, hammer through the writing with you. And then there are more editors who are less like a movie director, or a script editor. They're more like a movie producer, where it's like they see their job as to get all the talent, get all the trains running on time, and to make sure that the comic is coming out in a timely fashion. Everybody knows what they're doing. But the story and the day-to-day, the nuts and bolts of the storytelling, they leave to the writer and the artist. And I'm okay with either style. But yeah, it really comes down, I think, to the personality, and also what the editor thinks is going to be the biggest challenge on the series. Like, if you're writing a big two title that's part of an event that crosses over with all kinds of other titles, then the editor is probably going to be more like the movie producer, because they got all these, they got to make sure all the trains are coming and leaving the station at the right times. So they're going to spend most of their time thinking about, when you're writing a smaller, more, independent title, when it doesn't really matter when these come out, that, you're just trying to tell like a good story. The editor might be much more invested in helping you get the most out of your talent, keeping the writing, crisp and concise. And so a lot of it depends on what kind of comic you're creating.
What is the most important thing in a writer's toolkit?
Humility. I think that, the writers who make it are the ones that kind of fall in this sort of Goldilocks zone of ego, where it's like they are not so in love with their work that they feel like everything that drops from the pen is solid gold. You can't change any of it. But they're also not so demoralized by their own futility that they give up. that you got to be somewhere in between where it's like, I realize that this is not great and this isn't as good as I can do, but I'm confident enough that I know I can make it better. And I think those are the writers who end up making it, the ones who are this combination of humility and confidence.
Is if you're confident that you can make it better, how do you stop perfectionism from coming, from stopping you from turning in anything?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the challenge, I think, for a lot of writers. And I think the key is to, as you get used to putting in scripts, you just sort of begin to develop this instinct of when something's done. And it's never the same instinct of like, well, this is perfect. It's always, well, it's not perfect. There are things that I could change, but it's done. And I think that's an important instinct to hone as a writer, not to know when something's totally perfect, but to know when something's done. And I think for me, a good clue is when I'm changing things back and forth. It's like I had it this way, but then I changed it to that way. Now I'm changing it back to that way. That's a good clue to me that it's done, that I'm overboiling the cabbage at that point, and I just need to pick one and go forward and not keep changing it back and forth.
How important?
If it's not clear, if it's not clear which one's the right answer, then they're both probably okay.
How important? So wait, you don't look for a third way in that case?
Sometimes, but if I write an idea once and then I say, no, that's not right, and then I go to something else, and then I come back to that first idea, it's probably because the first idea was probably pretty good. I just had, either got too familiar with it or had a momentary sort of like, temper tantrum in my head and rejected it. But if I'm coming back to it, I think probably was a good idea to begin with.
Can you give an example from your work where that happened?
Oh gosh, it happens on like almost every script, where I go back to something I had before. I can't really think of like a monumental game-changing instance of that where everyone will know what I'm talking about, but it happens often, frequently. And I think that the most important thing to remember is that if you're going back and forth like that, you're not going forward. And as a writer, you always want to be moving forward.
How do you handle when you and an artist have conflicting takes on how a scene should go?
Well, it's pretty easy. If it's a visual, disagreement, then the artist wins. If it's a storytelling disagreement, then the writer wins.
Well, that's simple enough.
Yeah.
Mark, how would you like to end this by plugging all the stuff that you're working on right now?
Oh man, I'm all about the plugs. Yes, please, if you haven't already, go out and check out Superman Space Age with brilliant art by Mike and Laura Allred. Volume 1 is already on shelves, first of 3, and I think the second book comes out end of September. And then also we have a second series of Billionaire Island, which comes out starting in November, and also a second series of My Bad, which I'm doing with Bryce Ingman and Peter Krause, which also comes out in November.
How many publishers are you working with right now?
I think 4 at the moment.
Congratulations, Mark.
Slow. Thank you.
Thank you so much for doing this.
I have my finger in many sinister pies.
Sinister. I'm sure. Thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, my pleasure.